The courtroom was steeped in a kind of silence that felt alive. Morning light streamed through the high windows, cutting across polished wood and solemn faces. Every seat was taken, journalists, law students, citizens who believed they were witnessing something historic. At the center of it all sat Judge Tanya Chutkan, poised and unreadable, her robe falling in perfect folds, her expression carved from calm authority. Across the room, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted the microphone before her. She was not in her element here, no political rally, no committee hearing, just the cold, disciplined air of federal law. Yet her eyes held their usual fire. For her, this wasn't merely a hearing. It was a test of conviction. Could a voice that spoke for the people still echo within the walls of the court? Judge Chutkan's gavel struck once, firm and final. This session is now in order. A rustle of papers followed, and then silence again. Congresswoman Crockett. The judge began evenly. This court recognizes your record and your service, but you stand here today not as a lawmaker, but as a participant in a process that requires one thing above all: restraint. Crockett's chin lifted slightly. Restraint, Your Honor, she said, her tone calm, is a privilege often enjoyed by those who already have a voice. Judge Chutkan's gaze didn't shift. And yet, restraint is what allows every voice, yours included, to be heard in equal measure. Without order there is no justice. Without justice there is no freedom. That line carried a quiet weight. Even the reporters stopped writing for a moment. Crockett let the words hang before replying. Your Honor, she said, I understand order. I live by laws written long before I took office, but I also understand what happens when silence becomes the law. I represent people whose lives are shaped by others. Restraint, and they cannot afford it. Her words landed like small thunderclaps, not loud but deep. The court clerk shifted uncomfortably. One of the journalists in the back whispered, She's not backing down. Judge Chutkan leaned forward slightly, hands folded. You're not on trial for passion, Congresswoman. But this court will not let passion turn into provocation. The right to speak freely is not the right to disrupt justice. And who defines disruption? Crockett asked, her voice tightening. The speaker or the one who's uncomfortable listening? A flicker crossed Chutkan's face, not anger, but recognition. It was the question at the heart of the matter, the one no judge could easily answer. For a long moment the room felt suspended, every breath waiting for what would come next. Chutkan finally spoke, her tone softer but no less resolute. Freedom of speech is the cornerstone of our nation, but like any cornerstone, it supports something larger, the rule of law. In this courtroom, we balance rights against responsibility. Crockett met her eyes, and in Congress we balance truth against power. Sometimes the truth doesn't fit neatly within the rules. There it was, the clash of worlds. Law and liberty staring each other down across a polished oak table. Outside, television crews waited to dissect every line. But inside, it wasn't theater, it was principle against principle. Two women, both molded by justice, both unwilling to yield their vision of it. Judge Chutkan took a breath, her expression measured. Congresswoman, I've read your public remarks, your speeches, your interviews. You use words that inspire, but also words that inflame. Do you believe the right to speak is absolute? I believe. Crockett said firmly that the right to speak is what keeps the powerful accountable. If my words make someone uncomfortable, maybe that discomfort is the beginning of change. The judge considered that, and if your words endanger the fairness of a trial, if they prejudice justice itself, Crockett's reply came without pause, then maybe justice needs to be strong enough to stand beside truth, not hide from it. The room went silent again. Even the hum of the ceiling lights seemed to fade. What began as a formal inquiry was becoming something deeper, a reflection on the boundaries of democracy itself. Judge Chutkan spoke slowly now, each word deliberate. History is filled with people who believed their cause justified every word they spoke. Some changed the world, others burned it down, maybe. Crockett said quietly, the only difference between the two was who got to write the verdict. The judge's eyes softened not agreement but understanding. Both women knew they were standing in the gray zone, where ideals meet consequences. Chutkan broke the silence first. "Congresswoman, you speak like someone who believes the courtroom is another battlefield. But it isn't. Here, the law is not an opinion, it's a framework." Crockett's voice steadied. "And yet, every framework starts with someone's opinion that something needed to change. For a heartbeat, it felt as though time itself had stopped between them. Neither sought victory, both sought validation. Crockett wanted acknowledgement that her voice mattered even here. Chutkan wanted recognition that law wasn't her weapon, it was her duty. The sound of the ticking clock behind the bench grew sharper. The court reporters' pens scratched quickly, trying to keep up. Judge Chutkan finally said, "Free speech does not vanish in this room, Congresswoman, but it must coexist with respect. When speech crosses into defiance of due process, it ceases to be a right and becomes contempt." Crockett looked down for a moment, then back up. "Respect, Your Honor, isn't silence, it's truth, spoken even when it's inconvenient." Chutkan nodded once, a small gesture, but meaningful. "And justice, Congresswoman, is ensuring that truth does not destroy fairness." The gavel struck softly this time, signaling a pause, not an end. "We'll adjourn until the afternoon," she said. As everyone rose, the tension didn't leave the room. It lingered like heat after a storm. Chutkan gathered her papers, her expression unreadable. Crockett stood, shoulders straight, eyes forward. Neither woman looked defeated. Outside, reporters were already shouting questions. "Did you feel silenced, Congresswoman? Is the court limiting speech? Was it a clash or a conversation?" But those inside the courtroom knew what it truly was, a rare confrontation between two different guardians of the same nation's soul. Justice had spoken, so had freedom, and the space between them was where the real story began. When the afternoon session began, the air inside the courtroom felt heavier, almost charged. The earlier exchanges had traveled far beyond legal argument. They had touched something larger, a question of who gets to define truth when law and liberty meet face to face. Judge Tanya Chutkan returned to the bench with the same calm authority, her robe flowing as she sat. Her eyes, however, carried a quiet sharpness, the look of someone who had been thinking deeply during recess. Across from her, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was already in her seat, flipping through her notes with the intensity of someone preparing not to defend herself, but an idea. When the gavel fell again, it was softer this time, but the meaning was clear. The discussion would continue, and this time it would go deeper. "Congresswoman," Judge Chutkan began, "this court respects your service and your right to speak, but it must also examine the consequences of that speech. You once said that the courtroom should never fear the truth. Do you still believe that?" Crockett looked up immediately. "I do, Your Honor. The courtroom is where truth should be strongest, not most restricted." Chutkan nodded slightly. "And yet, we've seen moments when truth, or what one believes to be truth, has corrupted the process of justice. When statements made outside this courtroom influenced juries, endangered witnesses, or undermined fairness itself. I understand the concern." Crockett replied, "But we can't treat speech as a threat every time it challenges comfort. The founders didn't write the First Amendment to protect polite opinions. They wrote it to protect the ones that shake power, Judge Chutkan's expression remained composed. Power, Congresswoman, is not always the enemy. Sometimes it's the very structure that keeps chaos from ruling. Crockett leaned forward. But what happens when that structure starts deciding which voices get heard? When control becomes convenience and silence becomes policy? The exchange was sharp but respectful, a duel fought not with emotion, but with conviction. The gallery watched in complete stillness, sensing that this was no ordinary debate. It was the kind of dialogue that peeled back layers of democracy itself. Chutkan reached for a document on her desk. This case, Congresswoman, is not about silencing anyone. It's about boundaries. There are precedents, Schenck v. United States, Brandenburg v. Ohio, that define when speech crosses into harm. You, of all people, know the weight of words in public spaces. I do, Crockett replied quickly. And I also know that the same precedents have been used to punish dissent. We've seen it throughout history when those in power feared words more than weapons. The judge looked up again, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. And yet, you sit here as a congresswoman in a country where your words are broadcast freely every day. Doesn't that say something about our endurance as a democracy? Crockett smiled faintly. It says we're strong enough to argue, but maybe not strong enough to listen. The courtroom went still again. Even the security guards along the wall seemed to pause. For a few seconds, neither woman spoke. The sound of the ceiling fans filled the space, slow, rhythmic, almost meditative. Then Judge Chutkan broke the silence. Congresswoman Crockett, you remind me of the attorneys who stand before this bench and say, I'm just speaking truth to power. But the courtroom isn't built for protest. It's built for process. Crockett replied gently but firmly, and yet, process without protest becomes ritual, not justice. Something flickered in the judge's eyes, not irritation, but respect. The Congresswoman wasn't here to defy the system. She was here to test its strength. That, in its own way, was an act of faith in the rule of law. Do you believe, the judge asked, that there should be any limits on speech? Yes, Crockett answered after a brief pause. Speech that incites violence, speech that dehumanizes, but not speech that criticizes power no matter how sharp it sounds. And who decides which is which? Chutkan pressed. Because in every era someone believes their words are righteous even when they're reckless. Crockett looked thoughtful. Then maybe the answer isn't to limit speech, but to hold people accountable for what follows it. The words themselves shouldn't be chained, only the actions that betray them. The judge leaned back slightly, considering. The logic wasn't lost on her. In many ways, Crockett's philosophy echoed that of civil rights leaders who believed that speech, even when uncomfortable, was the first step toward justice. But a courtroom wasn't the streets of protest or the halls of Congress. It was a place where law met order and words could bend outcomes. Congresswoman, Chutkan said carefully, I don't disagree with your ideals, but this court must ensure that speech doesn't endanger justice. That's not suppression, that's preservation. Crockett met her gaze with quiet defiance. And I must ensure that justice doesn't hide behind procedure. That's not rebellion, that's responsibility. The gallery shifted again. No one dared speak, but the tension hummed like electricity. It wasn't hostility. It was history unfolding, two perspectives locked in respectful resistance. Chutkan sighed softly, her tone now more reflective than sharp. You and I are not so different, Congresswoman. We both serve systems built on words, you in lawmaking, I in lawkeeping, but we stand at opposite ends of the same bridge. You build it, I make sure it holds, Crockett nodded slowly, and bridges are meant to be crossed, your honor not guarded forever. For a moment both women smiled. It wasn't triumph or surrender, it was recognition. They understood each other's burdens. One carried the weight of control, the other the weight of change. Chutkan looked down at her notes again. Do you believe your recent public statements about ongoing cases were responsible? Crockett hesitated only a second. They were truthful, and truth, Your Honor, is always responsible, even when inconvenient. The judge studied her face. Then I hope your truth never finds itself on the wrong side of justice. Crockett replied quietly, and I hope justice never finds itself afraid of my truth. The gavel struck again, not in anger, but to give space for reflection. The sound echoed like a heartbeat, steady and final. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 10, Chutkan said. We'll continue our examination of free expression within judicial boundaries. As people began to rise, the Congresswoman gathered her papers with slow precision. The reporters in the back whispered excitedly, already forming headlines in their minds. But the real story wasn't in the sound bites. It was in the silent respect that had settled between the two women. Both had drawn their lines in principle. Both had defended their ground, and both, in their own ways, had proven that the foundation of democracy isn't agreement, it's endurance. When Crockett walked out of the courtroom that day, the cameras flashed like lightning. She didn't stop to speak. She simply said to the reporters, "Freedom and justice are not enemies. They're sisters, they argue, but they never stop fighting for each other." Inside, Judge Chutkan sat alone for a moment, gazing at the empty courtroom. The echo of Crockett's last words lingered in her mind. There was something noble, even necessary, about disagreement spoken with courage. For the first time that day, the judge allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps, she thought, freedom didn't threaten justice after all. Perhaps it was what kept it alive. The following morning, the courthouse steps were lined with reporters before dawn. News outlets had turned the debate into a national moment. Freedom vs. order, the headlines read. Commentators on every network speculated about the tension inside that courtroom, calling it a battle of conviction wrapped in civility. But inside, away from the flash of cameras, the atmosphere was calmer. Judge Tanya Chutkan entered the courtroom without fanfare, her black robe sweeping across the floor as she took her seat. She knew the world was watching, but the courtroom was still her domain, and in her domain, order reigned above spectacle. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett arrived moments later. She looked rested, composed, but there was a new weight in her eyes. She had read the headlines too, seen how her words were dissected and twisted. Today, she seemed determined not to perform for anyone, only to stand for what she believed. The gavel struck once, clean and sharp, before we proceed. Judge Chutkan began, I want to remind everyone in this courtroom, and beyond it, that justice does not serve the camera. It serves the Constitution. Our discussion today concerns not politics, but principle. Crockett nodded respectfully. Understood, Your Honor. The judge continued, Yesterday we spoke about freedom's reach. Today, we must discuss its restraint. There was no accusation in her tone, only purpose. She turned a page from the bench file. Congresswoman, some of your recent public statements referenced ongoing legal matters. Do you believe that public opinion should influence the judicial process? Crockett folded her hands. I believe the public has a right to know how justice operates. Transparency builds trust. Transparency, Chutkan replied, is not the same as commentary. When someone of your position speaks, the words carry power, sometimes more power than intended. Crockett met her gaze steadily. And when the court speaks, it carries silence. People only hear decisions, not the reasoning behind them. Isn't that a kind of power too? The judge leaned back slightly, considering. You're right. Power exists in both words and silence. But power is not the issue. responsibility is. For the first time, Crockett's voice softened. I understand responsibility, Your Honor. I've seen what happens when people lose faith in justice. They stop showing up, stop believing the law protects them. That's why I speak. Chutkan nodded. And I understand why you do. But consider this: the same power that gives you a platform also gives your words potential to shape perception. If justice begins to look like politics, its foundation cracks. Crockett's reply came quickly. And if justice hides behind procedure, people stop believing it's theirs. The room went silent again, that heavy, sacred silence that filled the space between two kinds of truth. Judge Chutkan clasped her hands together. You and I are arguing two sides of the same coin, Congresswoman. You want justice to be seen. I want it to be trusted. The challenge is that sometimes visibility and trust don't coexist. Crockett's brow furrowed slightly. Maybe they could, if the system wasn't built to keep the public outside the doors. There was no hostility, just exhaustion, the tone of two women who had spent their lives wrestling with ideals larger than themselves. Chutkan sighed softly. This is why the gavel feels heavier some days, she said quietly. Because it's not just about rulings or rules, it's about balance, the kind that keeps chaos from swallowing fairness whole. Crockett leaned forward, voice low. And that's why I speak, Your Honor. Because if I don't, someone else will, someone who doesn't believe in fairness at all. The judge looked at her for a long moment. And yet, she said finally, if everyone speaks without boundary, there will be no fairness left to protect. Crockett smiled faintly. Then maybe the answer isn't to silence people. Maybe it's to teach them what fairness actually means. For a moment, the judge said nothing. Her eyes softened. That's where we agree. The words hung there, a small bridge between two ideologies. Both women understood that change and control were not opposites but partners. One built, the other stabilized. After a pause, Chutkan continued. Congresswoman, I reviewed the transcript of your recent town hall. You said, and I quote, if the courtroom won't hear us, the streets will. Do you stand by that statement? Crockett looked directly at her. I do, because when institutions fail to reflect the people they serve, the people find another way to be heard. Do you believe? The judge asked evenly that such statements could encourage defiance of lawful process. No, Your Honor, Crockett replied firmly. I believe they remind people that justice must remain accountable, that courts are not temples, they are tools, and tools must serve those who built them. Chutkan's expression remained unreadable, a poetic sentiment. She said quietly, but remember, a tool misused can cause harm. I know, Crockett said. But so can silence. The room felt electric again. The audience leaned in without realizing. Judge Chutkan closed the file before her. Do you understand, Congresswoman, that the court must sometimes impose restrictions not to silence, but to safeguard the process itself? I understand, Your Honor. Crockett said, her tone firm but respectful. But understand this. Every time someone is told their voice threatens justice, we risk teaching them that silence is safer than truth. And that's the beginning of decay. The judge didn't respond right away. Her eyes drifted across the courtroom, the press, the public, the officers standing still as statues. She could feel the weight of her own words, the centuries of precedent behind them, the lives shaped by decisions made in rooms like this one. Finally, she spoke. Do you know why I became a judge, Congresswoman? Crockett shook her head slightly. Because as a young lawyer, I realized that passion wins headlines, but discipline wins justice. Emotion moves hearts, but law moves history. Crockett smiled gently. And yet, Your Honor, without emotion, history doesn't change at all. that drew the faintest hint of a smile from the judge. Perhaps the law needs people like you to test its strength. And perhaps, Crockett said softly, people like me need judges like you to remind us where the edge is. It was a rare moment. The tension broke, replaced by something like mutual respect. Two women from different worlds, realizing they were part of the same fragile equation. Chutkan nodded once. Then maybe we've both learned something today. She lifted the gavel not as a symbol of dominance, but of closure. Court adjourned. The sound echoed deep and final. Outside, the world erupted again, microphones, questions, flashing lights. "Did you win, Congresswoman?" someone shouted. Crockett paused on the courthouse steps. The wind lifted a strand of her hair as she looked straight into the cameras. "This isn't about winning," she said quietly. "It's about understanding how far truth can go before someone tries to stop it." Inside the now empty courtroom, Judge Chutkan remained seated, eyes on the bench. The gavel rested beside her hand. It was just a piece of wood, yet it carried centuries of struggle, the balance between silence and speech, chaos and control. For a long time, she didn't move. The weight of the gavel felt heavier that day, not because of what it silenced, but because of what it had allowed to be said. The third day began with an unspoken tension that even the marble pillars seemed to absorb. By now, the world had turned this courtroom into a stage. Two women, one gavel, and a nation listening for the line between freedom and order. But inside, away from the noise, the air felt quieter than before. Respect had replaced confrontation. Both Judge Tanya Chutkan and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett understood what was at stake now. This wasn't about reputation anymore. It was about principle. Judge Chutkan entered as usual, her robe flowing in soft folds, her expression composed yet thoughtful. Congresswoman Crockett was already seated, a pen resting between her fingers but untouched. She wasn't preparing notes anymore. She was preparing words that came straight from belief. The courtroom stood when Chutkan took her place. The gavel struck, sharp and certain. Court is in session. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was deliberate. A shared understanding of the gravity of what was unfolding. Judge Chutkan began first. "Congresswoman, I've spent the last 2 nights reflecting on our discussions. Your defense of free speech is powerful, but this court must determine whether expression can ever outweigh responsibility within the rule of law." Crockett looked up, calm but unyielding. "And I've been thinking about something too. Your Honor, whether the rule of law can still serve its people if it stops protecting the power to speak." A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by a look from the bailiff. Chutkan folded her hands. "Do you believe, then, that words should never be limited, not even in court where the sanctity of justice can be shaped or shattered by public perception?" Crockett didn't flinch. "I believe words must be weighed, not caged. If we limit speech because it might disrupt, then we mistake peace for progress. Courts don't exist to keep society comfortable. They exist to keep it honest." Chutkan listened carefully. There was a rhythm to Crockett's words, a conviction that came from somewhere deeper than politics. "Honesty," the judge replied, "is vital, but so is trust. When speech begins to sway justice before evidence is heard, that trust erodes. You may win honesty, but you lose faith." Crockett leaned forward, voice steady. "And what good is faith, Your Honor, if it demands silence in exchange for comfort? People don't lose faith in justice because of what's said. They lose it because they feel unheard." The judge exhaled softly. Perhaps the problem is not speech itself, but the noise it creates, noise that drowns out truth before it's proven. Then maybe the answer. Crockett said gently, isn't to quiet the voices, but to listen harder. Those words hung in the room like music, not loud, but resonant. For a long moment, Judge Chutkan said nothing. The faint tapping of the stenographer's keys filled the silence. Then, with a slow nod, the judge began again. Congresswoman, you said yesterday that courts are tools, that they belong to the people. I don't disagree, but tools must be handled with care. Justice requires discipline, even when truth demands courage. Crockett's gaze softened. And courage, Your Honor, requires the freedom to question discipline. The audience shifted again, small movements, quiet breaths. Every exchange between them felt like a lesson disguised as a duel. Judge Chutkan spoke again, her tone lower now, almost reflective. Do you know what I fear most, Congresswoman? Not disorder, not protest, but indifference. A society that no longer cares enough to argue. Debate keeps democracy alive. Crockett nodded slowly. Then maybe we're both doing our part, you keeping the system steady, me keeping it restless. That line brought a small smile to Chutkan's face. Restlessness, she said softly, is a sign of life. But chaos is what kills it. Crockett's response came without hesitation. And silence is what buries it. For a few seconds, they just looked at each other, two women, two truths, one goal. Judge Chutkan finally broke the moment. Congresswoman, I must render a ruling today. This court cannot punish speech for existing, but it can set standards for responsibility. You will not be censured for your words, but this court will issue an advisory that reminds all public officials of their duty to protect the integrity of judicial processes. Crockett listened carefully, her face unreadable. So I'm free to speak. Yes, Chutkan said, but with understanding. The freedom to speak carries the burden to consider. Words have wings, Congresswoman, but they also cast shadows. Crockett smiled faintly, and yet, Your Honor, shadows only exist where there's light. The line drew quiet admiration across the room. Even the judge's lips curved slightly upward before she composed herself again. Chutkan nodded. Then let the record show that this court affirms the right to expression, within the bounds of respect for justice. We cannot silence conviction. We can only remind it to walk with caution. Crockett stood slowly, her voice calm but charged with sincerity. Your Honor, I can live with that. Because if freedom and justice are to survive together, they must learn to walk side by side, even if one occasionally steps on the other's toes. The judge's gaze softened further. Perhaps that's what democracy truly is, the art of not breaking apart when we disagree. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. The bailiff glanced toward the judge, who gave a small nod to restore order, though she didn't seem bothered by the quiet emotion rising in the room. Chutkan spoke once more. Congresswoman, I believe you mean well. Your fire reminds us all why the First Amendment endures. But promise me this, use that fire to illuminate, not to burn. Crockett's answer was almost a whisper. Only if justice promises not to dim the light it fears. For a moment, they both smiled, not in triumph or defeat, but in recognition. There was no winner here, only a deeper understanding that both freedom and law existed to serve something greater, the people themselves. Judge Chutkan lifted the gavel slowly. This court has reached its conclusion. Let the discussion stand as a reminder. Speech is free, but not free of consequence. Justice is firm, but not without heart. She brought the gavel down once. The sound echoed deep, powerful, final. As the crowd began to rise, something remarkable happened. No one spoke. No applause, no shouting, just quiet reflection. It was as if everyone understood that they had witnessed more than a ruling. They had seen two truths meet without destroying each other. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited once again. The reporters crowded near the steps as Crockett exited. The sun hit her face as she paused to speak. "Today wasn't about me or the judge," she said softly. "It was about remembering that freedom and fairness are not enemies. They're both hard to live with, but impossible to live without." She smiled briefly, then walked away, leaving microphones still outstretched, questions unanswered. Inside, Judge Chutkan remained on the bench for several quiet moments before removing her robe. Her eyes drifted to the empty chairs, the same ones that had held tension, defiance, respect. She whispered to herself, "Justice may be blind, but she hears every word." As she stood and walked toward her chambers, the light from the windows caught the edge of her gavel, turning it gold for a brief second, as if the symbol of authority itself had absorbed a bit of that same light Jasmine Crockett fought to keep alive. The courthouse steps had never been so quiet the morning after the verdict. No protesters, no shouting, no signs, just a lingering hush that seemed to hang between justice and reflection. The world had watched a battle of principles unfold not for victory, but for meaning, and now even the air felt different, like the city was exhaling after holding its breath too long. Inside her chambers, Judge Tanya Chutkan sat at her desk, surrounded by papers she had already read 100 times. The light from her window fell across the wooden floor, warm and soft, but her mind wasn't on the documents before her. It was on the echoes that still lingered from the courtroom. She thought of Jasmine Crockett's words, "Shadows only exist where there's light," simple but true. Freedom was light, law was structure. Both could blind if not balanced. Chutkan leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. For years she had carried the weight of rulings, decisions, and public scrutiny, but this one felt different. It wasn't about a law or a precedent. It was about people, about what happens when conviction meets restraint. On the other side of the city, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood by her window, watching the morning unfold. She had no press conference planned today, no interviews, no statements, just quiet, a kind of quiet she hadn't known in months. For once, she didn't feel the need to speak, because maybe, just maybe, the silence itself was saying enough. Her phone buzzed with messages, reporters asking for comments, supporters cheering her courage, critics questioning her motives. She didn't answer any of them. She simply stared outside at a group of students crossing the street, young, passionate, unafraid to voice their minds. It reminded her why she had spoken in the first place. Freedom wasn't comfortable. It was messy, loud, imperfect. But it was necessary. Back in the courthouse, Judge Chutkan met with a few of her clerks. They expected her to be brisk as always, but instead she spoke softly. "Do you all know what made yesterday different?" she asked. One clerk hesitated. The attention it got. Chutkan shook her head. "The honesty. We talk about justice all the time, but we rarely stop to ask what it costs to keep it alive. Yesterday I saw that cost, and the courage it takes to pay it." Her clerks exchanged glances. None of them had seen her this introspective before. The truth, she continued, isn't something a judge can declare. It's something people have to keep demanding, even when it's uncomfortable. That afternoon, a quiet meeting was scheduled at the National Forum on Civic Integrity. Both women were invited separately. Neither had expected the other to attend, but fate had its own sense of timing. Judge Chutkan arrived first, dressed plainly, not in her robe but in a navy suit. She took a seat near the back, away from the stage. A few minutes later, Jasmine Crockett entered, wearing a dark red blazer that caught the light just enough to stand out without screaming for it. When her eyes met Chutkan's across the room, both paused, not in confrontation, but in mutual respect. The moderator introduced the session, today's discussion, the limits of free speech in institutions of justice. We are joined by individuals who understand that balance better than most. Neither expected to speak, but when the moderator asked for closing reflections, the room turned naturally toward the two of them. Judge Chutkan rose first. Her voice was measured, thoughtful. The courtroom is not a battlefield. It's a bridge, fragile but necessary. It stands between passion and order, and that bridge survives only when both sides remember why it exists, not to silence one another, but to meet in the middle. The audience was silent. She continued, "We live in a time where everyone wants to be heard, but few want to listen. The law demands listening even when we disagree, even when we ache to respond. That patience, that restraint is what separates justice from chaos." When she finished, Crockett stood slowly, her eyes never leaving the judge. "I agree," she began, "but bridges only matter if people are allowed to cross them. Free speech is the path that leads us there. Without it, even the best laws become walls instead of doors." She took a step forward. "I've learned something from all this. Freedom isn't about saying everything we think. It's about daring to say what matters, even when it shakes the room." A quiet nod from Chutkan. The crowd watched as the two women, once opponents, now stood side by side at the front. Crockett smiled faintly. "You know, Your Honor, when I first stood in your courtroom, I thought justice was about control. Now I think it's about courage." Chutkan returned the smile. "And I thought free speech was about noise. Now I see it's about necessity." Applause rose slowly, genuine and deep, not for a winner or a loser, but for understanding something rarer than agreement and far more powerful. Later, as the event ended, Crockett approached the judge quietly. "You were fair," she said. Chutkan shook her head slightly. "You were fearless. That's harder." They shared a brief handshake, the kind that carried more than formality, a silent acknowledgment that both had changed, just a little, because of each other. Outside, the sun had begun to set. The city glowed in soft orange light. The same steps where protests once echoed were now empty, peaceful, almost reverent. Crockett paused at the top of the stairs. "Do you ever think," she asked softly, "that maybe the First Amendment and justice are just two sides of the same coin? One gives voice, the other gives balance." Chutkan looked out at the horizon. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe they're two instruments in the same orchestra. Alone they sound incomplete. Together they make sense." The wind picked up slightly, carrying away the last sounds of the day. For a moment both women stood in silence, no gavel, no arguments, no headlines. Just two voices that had finally learned to coexist in the quiet they had created. As they parted ways, neither turned back. There was no need to. The debate was over, but its echo would live far beyond the courtroom. It would live in classrooms, in conversations, in the hearts of those who understood what they had witnessed, not a clash, but a convergence. Because in the end, it wasn't about who spoke louder. It was about who listened deeper, and that, more than any verdict, was the true victory.